It starts like any other day, until it doesn't. A black woman walks into a courthouse, calm, composed, and completely unaware that she's about to be assaulted by those sworn to uphold the law. They think she's nobody. They humiliate her, violate her, and laugh while doing it. But what they don't know is, they just laid hands on the wrong person. Because she's not just another citizen. She's the one person who has the power to destroy them. Legally. What follows is a storm of justice, exposure, and a courtroom twist that flips everything on its head. Stick around. You're not ready for what's coming. And hey, tell us where you're watching from, and what time. Drop it in the comments below. It was just after 8 a.m., when Celeste Monroe stepped out of her silver Buick, and walked up the stone steps of the Charleston Federal Courthouse. The sun was rising slowly, behind the old Spanish moss trees, casting long shadows on the steps. She adjusted the collar of her navy blue blazer, squared her shoulders, and clutched a slim leather portfolio in one hand. Her heels clicked softly against the concrete. Each step, a quiet declaration. She didn't wear her judicial robe outside the courtroom. She never did. She preferred to enter buildings like a citizen. Quiet. Composed. Observant. But that day, she wasn't greeted as a judge. She wasn't even seen as someone with authority. She was just another black woman, walking into a place where power had never come easy. At the main security checkpoint, the energy shifted the moment she approached. Deputy Hank Riker, a court bailiff, known for his rigid attitude and old-school demeanor, narrowed his eyes as she neared the metal detectors. He didn't recognize her. And more importantly, he didn't care to. He stepped forward, thick forearms crossed, and held up a gloved hand. "Ma'am," he said, voice gruff, "I'm going to need you to step out of line." Celeste paused, for only a moment. "Is there a problem, officer?" Riker didn't answer right away. His eyes swept over her, from her silver locks, twisted neatly along her scalp, to her pressed slacks, to the calm but confident look in her eye. Something about her bothered him. She looked like she belonged there. And in his world, people like her needed to be reminded who was really in charge. No ID displayed. "You can't just waltz into a federal building, looking like that," he muttered. Celeste calmly reached into her blazer, and produced her federal credentials. The badge gleamed under the light, but Riker didn't even look at it. He took it from her hand, gave it a cursory glance, then slipped it into his pocket. She raised an eyebrow. "I'd like that returned." He stepped in closer. "You in a rush to get somewhere, sweetheart?" The word hit, like a slap. A second guard, a younger woman, shifted nervously by the X-ray scanner. She clearly recognized the tension, but said nothing. Just watched. "I need to get to a courtroom," Celeste said firmly. "Then you'll follow my procedure," Riker snapped. "And that includes random checks. Let's go." He didn't give her time to respond. With one heavy hand on her upper arm, he steered her toward a side hallway, away from the foot traffic, into a windowless screening room, just beyond the security zone. The air inside was cool, and still. There was a steel chair in the center of the room. A rolling cart of scanning equipment. And a pair of clippers, sitting idle, on the edge. Celeste's heart thudded once, in her chest. "I don't consent to this," she said clearly. "You have no legal cause to detain me." "You're acting suspicious," Riker replied, motioning to the chair. "That's cause enough. Sit down." She didn't move. He leaned in close. "You think that badge you flashed means something?" "Not here. Not to me." In an instant, two other officers entered the room. One of them, a man in his 30s with a shaved head and nervous eyes, grabbed her left wrist. Another held the other side of the chair. Celeste's voice rose. This is a violation. I want your names. But no one answered. Instead, Riker grabbed the clippers. What are you doing? She demanded. Standard protocol. You could be hiding something in that mop, he said, gesturing to her locks. Celeste tried to rise, but a sharp grip pushed her back down. The clippers buzzed to life. The sound filled the room like a swarm of bees. Before she could react, she felt the cold vibration touch her scalp. A thick coil of silver hair fell to the floor. Then another. And another. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She sat there, as her dignity was stripped from her, strand by strand. Watched it collect in piles on the tiled floor, like pieces of her past being torn away. Laughter echoed from one of the guards. She looks better already, he muttered. Should have come in here with some respect, Riker said, wiping loose hairs from his sleeve. Now you look more presentable. Celeste's fists clenched in her lap, the skin over her knuckles pale. But her voice, when it returned, was steady. You'll regret this. He leaned down, sneering. People like you always say that. And then, just as quickly as it began, it ended. Riker opened the door and gestured back toward the hall. You're free to go. Courtroom's that way, he said, mockingly. Celeste rose slowly. Hands trembling, only slightly. She took her badge back from Riker's desk, without asking, and walked out into the hall. Her steps were even. Her expression, unreadable. But in her chest, something burned. Hotter than rage. Deeper than humiliation. It was purpose. And in just a few minutes, that purpose would change everything. Because what Riker didn't know was this. She wasn't there to observe. She wasn't there as a defendant. She wasn't there for anyone else's judgment. She was the judge. And she was about to take her seat on the bench. The clippers buzzed in her ears, long after she left that cold, windowless room. Every step she took toward the courtroom felt heavier than the last. Not because of fear. But because of fury, held in check. Her scalp tingled, where her hair had once proudly grown. Silver coils, years in the making. Rooted in family. In history. In identity. Now gone. Uneven tufts were all that remained. The silence in the hall felt suffocating. Celeste passed two clerks who looked at her, then quickly looked away. They had heard. Maybe, they had even seen. But not one of them had spoken up. She didn't stop walking. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Down the corridor, a low hum of voices filtered from the courtroom double doors. It was a high-profile morning. A police misconduct hearing. Several officers involved in a brutal incident, during a protest last year. National attention. Heavy press. Celeste was supposed to enter from the private chambers. Her robe waiting inside. Staff prepped. Decorum preserved. But today, that plan didn't matter. She stopped just outside the courtroom. Took a deep breath. Then pushed both doors open, wide. The courtroom stilled, instantly. Conversations, cut off mid-sentence. Heads turned. And then the realization began to ripple. Her shoes clicked loudly against the marble floor as she walked past rows of lawyers, journalists, plaintiffs, and defendants. Some stared in confusion. Others, in disbelief. At the front, behind the judge's bench, her chair sat, empty. Waiting. And then, it hit them. The woman they had watched be escorted through the hall like a suspect. The woman, whose scalp bore the evidence of brutality. Was not a victim of circumstance. She was the judge. Celeste stepped behind the bench and turned slowly, to face the courtroom. Her face was calm. Cold even. The kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from precision. Someone near the defense table dropped a pen. The bailiff, the same man who had held the clippers, was still posted by the side door. When she made eye contact with him, he went absolutely still. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The blood drained from his face. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached for the robe folded neatly over the arm of her chair. She didn't ask for help. She didn't wait for ceremony. She slipped it on herself, one slow movement at a time. It rested on her shoulders, like armor. She turned to the court clerk. "Is the docket ready?" she asked, voice even. The clerk's voice cracked. "Yes, Your Honor." Celeste nodded once, then lowered herself into her chair. The leather groaned softly beneath her. She looked straight ahead. Her gaze never touched the man who had humiliated her. Not yet. Not directly. "We will begin today with preliminary testimony on Case 2371F, United States v. Charleston Police Department," she said. As if nothing had happened. Charges of abuse of power, excessive force, and civil rights violations. All parties present. A murmur of, "Yes, Your Honor," echoed back. The attorneys were shifting in their seats. Some were wide-eyed. Others looked guilty. And some looked angry. Angry that a black woman had dared walk in after what they assumed had destroyed her. She ignored them all. "We will proceed." The first witness was called. An officer, who had been on duty during the protest in question. A man who had pushed an elderly veteran to the ground during a peaceful demonstration, breaking 2 of his ribs. Celeste listened carefully. Took notes. Asked no questions. Not yet. From the corner of her eye, she saw Riker slowly backing toward the rear of the courtroom. His hands twitched at his belt. His legs shifted, restlessly. He looked like he wanted to disappear. Like he knew, deep in his gut, that his moment was coming. He was right. After the second witness, she called a recess. The courtroom emptied, in a daze. Even the lawyers whispered, like they were afraid to speak too loud. Celeste stayed seated. After several minutes, when only her clerk, 2 officers, and Riker remained in the room, she finally looked at him. "Deputy Riker," she said. Voice sharp as glass. He stopped mid-step. "Step forward." His mouth opened, stammering. Yes, Your Honor." She motioned to the open center of the courtroom. "Now." He obeyed, moving like a man walking toward a cliff's edge. "State your full name, for the record." He blinked. "Excuse me." "You heard me. Hank. Hank Riker." "How long have you served as bailiff at this courthouse?" 14 years. She tapped a pen against her legal pad. Once. Twice. Then, she leaned forward. "And in those 14 years, how many women have you assaulted in that screening room?" The color drained from his face. Your Honor. I didn't know. That's not what I asked." He looked around for help. None came. "How many complaints have been filed against you, Deputy Riker?" "I don't. I'm not sure." Celeste's voice rose, not in volume, but in precision. 12. 12 formal complaints. All buried. All dismissed. Because you hid behind procedure and protocol. His mouth trembled. "I didn't know who you were. I thought." "And that's the problem, isn't it?" she snapped, voice cracking the stillness. "You thought I was no one. Just another black woman you could bully. Shave. Humiliate, for sport." The room was dead silent. "You didn't even bother to ask for my name." Riker tried to speak. But no sound came. Celeste rose from the bench. Because of you, this courthouse, this supposed temple of justice, has been stained. Because of your actions, the sanctity of this court is now under question. And because, you assaulted a federal judge, in her own courthouse, you are now the subject of a criminal investigation. Effective immediately. She turned to the officers standing by the exit. Escort Deputy Riker into custody. Separate from general population. Formal charges to follow. The officers moved quickly. Cuffs, already in hand. No, wait, Riker shouted. You can't do this. But he was wrong. She already had. The courtroom didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. Not after what had just happened. Deputy Hank Riker, once a fixture of control and intimidation in that courthouse, was now gone. Escorted out in cuffs. By 2 silent officers. His badge surrendered. His power, stripped. But the aftershock still lingered. It was in the silence. In the way the ceiling fans hummed, a little too loudly. In the sidelong glances shared between staff, who had known for years. And said nothing. Celeste Monroe sat back in her chair. Fingers laced together, over the bench. Her robe now draped over her like steel. There was no going back, to the way things were before. And truthfully, she didn't want to. Because something had shifted. Not just inside her, but inside the entire room. Her clerk entered quietly, holding a fresh stack of notes. Your Honor, she said cautiously. The next set of witnesses are being prepped. Celeste nodded. How long do we have? About 8 minutes. Celeste looked past her, out into the now empty gallery. Rows of wooden benches. The places where jurors, journalists, and the public would return any moment now. But she could still feel Riker's presence, like an oil stain on polished marble. She exhaled, slowly. This day had already defied every expectation. And it was only mid-morning. The door creaked behind her. Celeste turned. A young woman stepped inside. Maybe early 20s. Glasses fogged from rushing through the lobby. One of the interns. Her name was Megan. Smart. Quiet. Never spoke much, unless spoken to. She looked pale. Celeste gave a small nod. Everything okay? Megan hesitated. Then she closed the door behind her and stepped forward. I wanted to say, I saw it, she said, voice barely above a whisper. What happened with Deputy Riker this morning, outside the screening room? I didn't know what to do. I should have said something. I was scared. Celeste didn't answer right away. She just studied the young woman's trembling hands. Then she said, gently. Thank you for telling me. That matters. I didn't stop it. No, Celeste replied. But you're speaking now. That's more than most. Megan looked like she might cry. But she straightened her shoulders and added. If you need me to testify. I will. Celeste reached across the desk and placed a hand over the girl's. Just for a moment. No words. Just warmth. Then, the courtroom doors creaked again. This time, with more weight. The public was returning. Celeste stood. All rise, the clerk called out. Her voice, steadier this time. Everyone did. Even the ones who didn't want to. Even the ones who had once laughed at jokes Riker made behind closed doors. Celeste resumed her seat. Court is back in session. As the next witness took the stand. The atmosphere in the room had changed. Subtly, sharply. The power was no longer in question. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. The witness was a black father named Howard Briggs. Mid-40s. A warehouse foreman. Salt and pepper beard. Hands rough from decades of labor. His eyes were hollow, but determined. He was there to testify about how his 17-year-old son had been tackled and pinned during a peaceful protest by the same officers now seated at the defense table. One of them had crushed the boy's windpipe with his knee. The teen survived. Barely. But still couldn't speak, above a whisper. That had been 9 months ago. Howard sat on the witness stand and told the court everything. How they had begged for paramedics. How they were told, "He'll be fine. He's faking." How no one listened. And how, when the footage came out, none of the officers were disciplined. Celeste didn't interrupt once. She didn't need to. Because every word the man spoke was a blade, slicing through the courtroom, leaving no one untouched. When he finished, Celeste leaned forward. "Mr. Briggs. Thank you for your courage. I know this isn't easy." He nodded, his voice cracking. "I just want to know that it meant something. That someone is finally listening." Celeste looked at him. Not from the bench. Not as a judge. But as someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be silenced. "You've been heard," she said. A few minutes later, after he stepped down and walked slowly past the officers who had nearly taken his son's life, Celeste called for another short recess. Her chambers were quiet. Almost too quiet. She sat for a moment, staring at her reflection in the mirror above the washbasin. Her uneven hair. The raw patch just above her left ear. The woman in the mirror didn't look like a judge. She looked like someone who had just been through war. But maybe that's what justice was. Not a performance. Not a display of poise. But a battle for truth. One she had no intention of losing. There was a knock. Her clerk opened the door halfway. "Your Honor. The U.S. Attorney's Office just submitted a sealed motion. They want to escalate charges against Riker immediately. Civil rights violations, under federal law." Celeste didn't blink. "Good. Accept it." As the door shut, she finally allowed herself a breath. Not out of relief, but resolve. Today wasn't over. Not even close. Because the courtroom may have seen Riker fall, but they hadn't seen what came next. And the real reckoning was still to come. The courtroom was full again. But it wasn't the same room anymore. Something unspoken had shifted. It hung in the air, like electricity. Before a thunderstorm. The kind of weight that made people sit straighter in their chairs, speak a little quieter, and think twice before assuming they knew who held the power. Celeste Monroe stepped back onto the bench. With a presence that was undeniable. No bailiff announced her this time. No ceremonial flourish. Just the sound of her shoes against the hardwood floor. And the quiet rustle of her robe. As she took her seat, everyone rose, instinctively. She didn't speak right away. She just looked out over the room. At the defendants. The press. The attorneys. And the silent crowd of onlookers who had returned. Some still wide-eyed from what they'd witnessed earlier. They were waiting to see what she would do next. How far she'd go. Whether this was going to be a moment or a movement. She tapped the gavel, once. "Court is now in session," she said. And just like that, everything settled. She turned her attention to the attorneys seated at the prosecution table. Call your next witness. The room hushed again. As an officer, Lieutenant Daniel Cook was sworn in. Tall. Built like a linebacker. Face clean-shaven. With that rigid posture. That said, he thought the badge made him invincible. He sat down. Cleared his throat. And folded his hands in his lap. Celeste studied him, for a long second. She knew the type. Proud. Polished. Trained to lie with a smile. And never break a sweat. The prosecutor began her questioning. Methodical. Precise. Lieutenant Cook. You were present at the demonstration. On May 14th of last year, correct? Yes, ma'am. And during that time, you oversaw a team of 7 officers. Yes, that's correct. Did you personally authorize the use of force against protesters? Cook leaned forward slightly, speaking into the mic, like he was giving a press briefing. I authorized non-lethal crowd control measures. After protesters became aggressive, there was yelling, pushing. Some were armed with bottles and rocks. Any injuries reported from your team? No, ma'am. And the injuries sustained by protesters? Minor. Mostly bruises. Celeste's voice cut through. Before the prosecutor could move on. Lieutenant Cook. He turned toward her. Yes, Your Honor. Do you consider a crushed trachea to be a minor injury? The question hung in the air. Well, no ma'am. Of course not. Celeste leaned forward slightly. Then why did your official incident report describe it as soft tissue trauma? Consistent with resistance? Cook hesitated. That's standard language. It was based on initial impressions. Initial impressions from whom? He shifted in his seat. I believe it was Officer Valdez who filled out that section. Celeste kept her gaze locked on him. And did you review and approve that language? A pause. Then. Yes, Your Honor. Knowing that the victim was 17 years old and unarmed. Cook opened his mouth. Closed it. Then finally answered. Yes. Her tone never wavered. Do you believe justice was served that day? Silence. I believe we followed protocol. She sat back in her chair. That wasn't the question. Cook cleared his throat again. With respect, Your Honor. I can't answer that. That's not my role. Celeste nodded slowly. No. It's mine. She turned to the prosecution. You may proceed. The rest of the testimony was dry. Clinical. But every word landed like a blow. It wasn't just the facts. It was the way they tried to make them sound. Normal. Acceptable. Routine. When the recess was called again, the gallery buzzed with whispers. Reporters typing furiously. Advocates taking notes. A woman near the back clutched her chest, silently mouthing, "Thank you," as Celeste walked past. In her chambers, she took off her robe and hung it carefully. Then, she stared at it. For a moment longer than usual. The way it looked on the hanger. So plain. So harmless. And yet, outside that room, that robe carried weight. It changed everything. When she wore it, people stood. They listened. They feared her power. But just 2 hours earlier, wearing the same face, the same heart, The same dignity. Without the robe. She was assaulted and stripped. Like she didn't matter. That contradiction lived in her bones now. It burned behind her eyes. And echoed in her pulse. There was a knock. Your Honor. It was her clerk again. There's someone asking to speak with you, from the DOJ. They said it's urgent. Celeste straightened. Send them in. A man in a gray suit stepped through the door. Calm. Composed. He handed over a sealed envelope. Judge Monroe. I'm with the Office of Civil Rights. I was dispatched the moment reports surfaced about this morning's incident. Fast response, Celeste said, unfolding the letter. This courthouse is under federal review. What happened in that screening room is more than misconduct. It's a Title 18 violation. And now that we know the victim was a federal judge. He trailed off. Celeste didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The man continued. We're opening an immediate investigation into Charleston District Courthouse staff. Prior complaints. Suppression of reports. And potential obstruction. Good, she said quietly. Start with the supervisors who buried those 12 complaints against Riker. Then look at the judges who signed off. He nodded. As if he already knew she'd say that. Oh, and Judge Monroe, he added, pausing at the door. You should know. The footage of this morning has gone viral. It's everywhere. CNN. MSNBC. Social. Even some folks in the Senate are talking about it. Celeste gave the faintest shake of her head. I didn't do it for them. He smiled. No. That's why it matters. When he left, she sank slowly into her chair. Out there, in the courtroom, the next set of defense attorneys were gathering. She could already hear their shoes against the floor. The nervous shuffle of papers. The last-minute whispers between counsel. The fight wasn't over. But she was ready. Because today wasn't just about exposing one racist bailiff. It was about pulling the mask off an entire system. And it was far from done, unraveling. The courtroom was packed to capacity now. Word had spread. First, about the arrest. Then, the video. Then, the woman behind it. A federal judge. Who had walked into a courthouse. And been treated like she didn't belong. Only to take her rightful seat on the bench minutes later. Stripped. Humiliated. But unbroken. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Camera crews hovered outside. Reporters lined the back rows. Civil rights attorneys flew in from Atlanta, D.C., even Chicago. You could feel the pressure in the air. It wasn't just about a case anymore. This was bigger. It was history and justice. Crashing into each other. In real time. Judge Celeste Monroe stood just behind the bench. As the clerk whispered in her ear. They're here. The defense attorneys. They're asking for special counsel. Celeste raised an eyebrow. On what grounds? They say the case is tainted. That the judge is personally compromised. A slow breath left her lips. Of course. Of course, they'd try to flip it. They couldn't deny the facts. So they'd attack the face delivering them. Celeste nodded once. Let them ask. I'll give them their answer, on the record. She stepped out to a courtroom, humming with tension. All rise. The room obeyed. She didn't look left or right. She just walked. Took her place. Tapped her gavel, once. Be seated. The air shifted. Like a held breath being released. A defense attorney in a pinstripe suit rose. Confident. Late 40s. One of those voices. Trained for both jury trials and TV interviews. Your Honor. Before we proceed, we'd like to make a formal request. Due to recent developments. Celeste cut in. You mean the arrest of Deputy Riker? And the incident in the courthouse hallway? He hesitated. Yes, Your Honor. And your concern is what exactly? He cleared his throat. That these events may present a conflict of interest. A question of judicial impartiality. The gallery bristled. A low murmur swelled. Celeste didn't blink. You're suggesting that because I was assaulted this morning, I can't carry out the duties of my position? I'm suggesting, he said carefully, that the perception of bias. Celeste held up a hand. Let me stop you right there. She stood. Walked slowly to the edge of the bench. I was publicly assaulted. Humiliated. Not for what I said. Not for what I did. But for who I am. Because someone saw a black woman walking into a courtroom. And decided she couldn't possibly hold power. She paused. Let it sink in. And what did I do in response? I took my seat. I conducted this hearing. I followed every rule. Every code of conduct. I have been calm. Measured. Respectful. Even when others were not. The attorney's jaw clenched. Celeste continued. Voice sharper now. You know what real bias looks like, counselor. Real bias is a man using clippers. To shave off a woman's hair. Without cause. Without warrant. And without a single question about her name. Real bias is 12 ignored complaints. From people who looked like me. Buried by this very institution. She leaned forward. Eyes, locked on his. You want to talk about conflict of interest? Let's talk about how many judges signed off on Deputy Riker's behavior. Over the years. Let's talk about how many prosecutors declined to follow up. Let's talk about your firm's history of defending officers with abuse records longer than their resumes. He looked ready to object. But didn't. Because she was right. Celeste straightened. This court will proceed. I will not recuse myself. And if you believe the facts of this case, will not stand under my authority, you're welcome to appeal. I'll even provide the paperwork, myself. She tapped the gavel again. Next witness. The prosecution called forward someone new. Not a victim. Not a protester. A former courthouse employee. Middle-aged black woman. Sharp suit. Cropped hair. Glasses. Her name was Denise Talley. Celeste recognized her instantly. And not just from personnel files. Denise had worked in records for years. Quiet. Efficient. Never complained. And now, she was stepping into the light. Denise was sworn in. Sat down. Adjusted her blazer. The prosecutor approached. Ms. Talley. Can you tell us about your former position? At this courthouse. I was the record supervisor for 8 years. Before that, I worked the front desk. And during your time here, were you ever made aware of complaints against Deputy Riker? Her eyes hardened. Yes. Too many to count. Can you estimate? 12 official. At least twice that many informal. And what happened to those complaints? Denise glanced toward Celeste. Then spoke, slowly. They were mishandled. Some were marked as resolved. When they weren't. Some disappeared entirely. The courtroom stirred again. Who gave those instructions? There was a pause. Then. Judge Taryn Mahoney. That name. Hit like a thunderclap. Mahoney. Retired 6 months ago. Reputation, clean. Respected. Celeste's own mentor. Once upon a time. But here it was. A truth that couldn't be ignored. Why would he suppress those reports? The prosecutor asked. Denise's voice shook. But she answered. He said bringing them forward would undermine public trust. That it would make the courthouse look weak. Celeste sat, perfectly still. Because that lie, that specific lie, was one she had heard before. Justice delayed. To preserve appearances. Abuse tolerated. In the name of order. She glanced around the room. At every face who had once looked the other way. Some of them were realizing in real time that the structure they had served was not justice, but silence. Denise continued. Now stronger. I watched men like Riker walk these halls. With impunity. I watched young black interns get searched and questioned. I watched witnesses get intimidated, and brushed off. And every time I said something, I was told. That's just how it is. Her voice cracked. Well, not anymore. Celeste swallowed hard. It was the kind of testimony that didn't just support a case. It cracked a system wide open. She called for recess. Everyone stood. As Celeste stepped away from the bench, one of the young reporters in the gallery whispered. She's not just running this courtroom. She's rewriting it. And he was right. Because this wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a reckoning. One that would ripple far beyond that room. And it was far from over. By early afternoon, the courthouse steps were no longer quiet. What started as a few reporters with cameras had turned into a full crowd. Protesters. Community leaders. Citizens. Black. White. Old. Young. Some holding signs. Others, just standing. Watching. It wasn't chaos. It was something heavier than that. Focused. Waiting. And inside. Celeste Monroe sat at her desk. Looking out the window of her chambers. At the growing sea of faces. She could read the signs from where she was. Justice starts now. Protect black women. 12 complaints. 0 accountability. She closed her eyes for a moment. Not to escape. But to feel it all, fully. The noise. The pressure. The truth, rising to the surface. After years of being buried. Under red tape. And silence. There was another knock on her door. This time, it was her clerk. But behind her stood a man Celeste hadn't seen in almost a decade. Reverend Marcus Hill. He stepped forward. With the calm strength of someone who'd seen too much. And still chose to fight. His gray beard had grown in fully. Since the last time she'd seen him. His eyes, tired. But kind. Judge Monroe, he said. Reverend, she replied, rising. I won't take up much of your time. Just wanted you to know. We're out there. We see what you're doing. And we're with you. She nodded. Swallowing the sudden emotion. Pressing at the back of her throat. He handed her a folded piece of paper. Some of these people outside. They were victims too. Of Riker. Of others like him. They were never called into court. Never heard. But they're ready now. If you want their stories. They're ready to talk. She unfolded the list. Names. Phone numbers. Handwritten notes. It was longer than she expected. How many of these are new complaints, she asked. Most. Some go back years. Some were afraid. Some were told. It wasn't worth it. Celeste looked up. They were wrong. It is worth it, now. Marcus smiled faintly. It is, because of you. She didn't reply. But her silence was louder than words. When he left, she stared down at the list again. These weren't just names. These were the people this courthouse had ignored. Brushed off. Laughed at. Written off. But not anymore. Back in the courtroom. The gallery had doubled. Word of Denise Talley's testimony had spread like wildfire. Reporters had started live streaming. People outside were now watching on their phones. Through courthouse windows. Huddled together. In the October sun. The energy had changed. When Celeste walked in, the room stood again. But this time, it felt different. Not just out of tradition. Not just for her title. But for what she represented now. She tapped the gavel once. We're ready to proceed. The next witness was unexpected. The U.S. Marshal's Office had sent someone. Not to investigate. To testify. His name was Andrew Taylor. Black. Late 50s. Over 20 years of service. He walked with a slight limp. The result of an injury. Sustained back in 2001. During an arrest gone wrong. He had been stationed in the same courthouse. Years ago. And now. He stood before the bench again. This time. With a truth he couldn't carry in silence anymore. He took the oath. Sat down. Adjusted the mic. I worked here. From 2004 to 2012, he said. I saw a lot. Most of it, I let slide. I didn't want trouble. Didn't want to be labeled. The angry black officer. He looked straight at Celeste. But what I saw from Riker. I should have reported. I didn't. And I regret it. Celeste nodded slowly. Allowing him the space to speak. Without interruption. Taylor continued. He started small. Disrespect. Over-policing young men. Making comments. But it got worse. And by 2010. He wasn't just aggressive. He was dangerous. Did you report him? The prosecutor asked. I filed a memo to Internal Affairs, he said. It disappeared. When I asked about it. I was told, quote. He's the kind of man we want. Handling difficult people. The room reacted. Disgusted murmurs. Celeste's gavel quieted them. Taylor sat forward. I left this courthouse 2 years later. Not because of the work. But because of what it did to me. The silence. The guilt. But now. I'm here to tell the truth. Because Judge Monroe. What you did. Sitting in that chair after what they did to you. That's bigger than a bench. The room was still. And Celeste. For the first time all day. Didn't have an answer. Not because she was speechless. But because sometimes. When history shows up at your feet. You don't speak over it. You let it. Echo. The next morning. The air outside the courthouse was heavier than usual. Charleston's early fall sky. Gray, low. Pressing down on the city like a warning. But inside Judge Celeste Monroe's chambers. The silence felt colder. She sat at her desk. With a thick manila folder in front of her. One marked, confidential, internal records. It had been slipped to her by a court administrator, who didn't say a word. Just nodded. Left it on her desk. And walked out like it burned his hands to touch it. Celeste opened it, slowly. Inside were documents. Memos. Emails. MSS signatures. 12 formal complaints. Filed against Deputy Hank Riker. Over the last 15 years. All, dismissed. All, signed off. By a name she knew too well. Judge Terrence Mahoney. Her former mentor. Her sponsor into the federal circuit. The man who once told her, "You are exactly what the bench needs." But now. She saw his signature. At the bottom of denial after denial. Each form. Stamped with bureaucratic indifference. Allegation unsubstantiated. Lack of corroborating evidence. No further action required. And then. Tucked at the back of the folder. One memo stood out. A confidential communication. Between Judge Mahoney. And the head of courthouse security. From 5 years ago. Celeste read it once. Then again. It said. Riker may be rough around the edges. But he keeps order. Especially with certain groups. Best to leave well enough alone. Her fingers curled around the page. Until it crumpled. There it was. The quiet part. Said out loud. And it wasn't just about Riker anymore. It was the entire machine. That had kept him safe. That had protected him. Endorsed him. Encouraged him to get rougher. Louder. Crueler. So long. As it served order. Celeste leaned back in her chair. And stared at the ceiling. This wasn't a case anymore. It was a purge. She looked down at her own reflection. In the glossy desk. Her uneven hair. Her tired eyes. And yet. The fire still burned behind them. There was a knock. Her clerk, again. "Your Honor," she said quietly. "We've received a formal inquiry. From the Senate Judiciary Committee. They're asking for your statement. On judicial oversight failures. Tied to the Riker incident." Celeste gave a humorless smile. "Of course they are. Now that the cameras are rolling." The clerk hesitated. "There's more. 2 retired judges. And 1 former DA. Just resigned this morning. Citing health reasons." Celeste didn't respond. She just stood. "Bring in the attorneys. All of them. We're going to finish this today." An hour later. The courtroom was standing room only, again. And this time. It wasn't just locals. Reporters from the New York Times. Washington Post. Even the BBC. Were squeezed into the gallery. A row of young black law students. Sat shoulder to shoulder. In the front pew. Notebooks in their laps. Eyes wide open. This was no longer just about Charleston. This was national, now. Celeste took her seat. Tapped the gavel. "This court is in session." She turned her attention to the room. "Before we proceed with closing arguments, I'd like to enter into the record new material provided to this court." She nodded to her clerk, who handed a copy of the folder. "To both tables. This includes all complaints previously filed against Deputy Riker. All correspondence related to their suppression. And the names of every individual who signed off on dismissing them." The defense attorney tried to object. But Celeste raised her hand. "Sit down." The words were soft. But final. She turned to the gallery. "Let the record show that this court is no longer interested In protecting institutions. At the expense of individuals. We are no longer pretending. That silence is neutrality. Her eyes swept the room. Every signature in this folder represents a choice. Not a mistake. A choice. To ignore victims. To protect predators. To maintain an illusion of order. Built on fear. She looked directly into the defense attorney's face. And it ends today. A hush fell over the room. So deep you could hear someone's pen stop mid-scratch. And then, from the far side of the room, a voice called out, "Your Honor." It was a man. In his 60s. Standing hesitantly by the doorway. "May I speak?" There was a pause. Then, Celeste gave a small nod. He stepped forward. Hat in hand. "My name is Louis Bryant," he said. Voice shaking. "I was arrested in this building. In 2011, by Riker. For raising my voice. When my daughter's case was dismissed. He slammed me into a wall. Broke 2 of my ribs." Celeste nodded. "Was a complaint filed?" "I filed it myself. Right over there at the front desk. And they told me. I tripped and fell. That's what the report said. I never came back." He looked around the room. "But I'm here now." Celeste stood. "Anyone else?" A pause. Then one by one. Hands began to rise. 5. 10. 15 people. Every one of them. With a story. Every one of them. With a silence that had lasted too long. And now finally. A voice. Celeste didn't cry. She didn't smile. She didn't even move. She just watched. As the truth rose all around her. Not whispered. Not hidden. Not protected by robes or badges. But spoken. At last. The final day of the hearing. Began with rain. Not a soft drizzle. Not a cleansing shower. A downpour. The kind that washed over Charleston. Like a warning. And a reckoning. At the same time. Streets flooded. Power lines swayed. But still. They came. Reporters. Protesters. Clerks. Interns. Witnesses. They came with umbrellas. Ponchos. Cameras. And signs. Because by now. Everyone knew. What was happening in that courtroom. Wasn't just justice. It was history. Inside. The atmosphere was hushed. But electric. The air had a pulse. The kind you feel. Just before something irreversible happens. Celeste Monroe walked into the courtroom. In silence. No gavel yet. No declaration. She paused at the front of the bench. Looked out at the packed gallery. And then. She took off her robe. Folded it, gently. Laid it across the chair. She stood there. No longer shielded by title or tradition. Just a woman. Scarred, and standing. And she spoke. "I've sat behind this bench for years. I've worn the robe. Carried the title. Delivered rulings. Followed procedure. But I've also stayed silent. Longer than I should have. And today. I'm done. Being quiet." She glanced to the defense table. To the prosecution. Then to the courtroom full of citizens. Who had once been silenced. Ignored. Cast aside. This court finds Deputy Hank Riker. Guilty of abuse of power. Violation of civil rights. And official misconduct. But it doesn't stop there. She stepped forward. This court also recommends immediate review of every complaint ever filed under his name, and formal investigation into any official who suppressed them. She turned to the court reporter. Put that on the record. There was no applause. Only silence. The kind of silence that follows a bomb dropping. Then slowly, she reached for a folder beneath the desk. One that hadn't been opened yet. She held it up for everyone to see. This, she said, is a policy proposal. Effective immediately. I am instituting a mandate for all bailiffs, marshals, and courthouse personnel under this jurisdiction. Her voice never wavered. It's called the Monroe Mandate. A few heads lifted at the name. It requires comprehensive anti-bias training, psychological screening, regular evaluations, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior inside federal courthouses. She held it in the air. And I will take this to the circuit, to the judiciary, to the Senate, if I have to. Because what happened to me should have never happened to anyone. And I'm going to make damn sure it never happens again. There was movement in the gallery now. Small nods. Silent tears. Hands gripping one another. In stunned solidarity. She continued. I want to make something very clear. This was never about revenge. It's about responsibility. Accountability. About looking this broken system in the eye. And saying, not anymore. She turned to the defense. And to those who allowed this man to operate without consequence for over a decade. Consider yourselves on notice. She tapped the folder again. I will be forwarding recommendations for disbarment, formal review, and possible charges to the Department of Justice for every official who played a role in burying the truth. The courtroom didn't move. Couldn't move. Then Celeste looked up. Just past the benches. Toward the tall, arched window. Behind the gallery. The storm was still raging outside. But light was beginning to filter through. A beam of sun breaking across the marble floor. She nodded once, as if accepting the timing. Before we conclude, there's one more piece of business. She looked to the side entrance. The officers opened the door. And Hank Riker walked in. Still in cuffs. No longer in uniform. His face pale, hollow, broken, in a way that had nothing to do with bruises or beatings. He was led to the front. Stood beside his public defender. Celeste faced him. Not with vengeance, but with fire. Mr. Riker. This court sentences you to the maximum allowable penalties under federal law. 6 years imprisonment for abuse of power. 5 years for civil rights violations. And an additional year for obstruction. She paused. But that's just the legal part. He didn't look up. And here's the human part now. Her voice dropped. Calm, but slicing. You spent your career deciding who was worthy of dignity and who wasn't. You thought the badge made you immune. That silence would shield you. That people like me would never hold the gavel. Her eyes locked onto his. Well now. You get to sit in the seat you made for others. No badge. No robe. Just the weight Of what you've done. She nodded to the officers. Take him away. As Riker was escorted out. The courtroom didn't clap. No one cheered. They just watched. Because it wasn't about celebrating. It was about witnessing. And sometimes, that's more powerful than applause. Celeste looked down at the file again. The Monroe Mandate. She closed it. Lifted her robe from the bench. And spoke one final time. Court is adjourned.